Welcome to the panel and to all of you who are watching us on Facebook Live. Before I hand over to the first of our distinguished panelists, I'd just like to explain briefly how the next 55 minutes or so are going to run. It's obviously a very short time to even scratch the surface of such a big topic. To start off the conversation, each of our panelists is going to set the scene in a few minutes, and then there'll be a chance for people watching us on Facebook Live, welcome to you, to put their questions to them. The way viewers can ask questions and interact is just to comment on the Facebook page. I might ask a few questions myself as well, but do feel free to come in at any point after we've heard from the panelists, and I'll do my best to relay as many of your questions as I can. The discussion after the presentations will be divided into two parts. First, we'll discuss the unique relationship Scotland has with Europe, which goes back many centuries. Then we'll turn things round and look at Europeans here in Scotland with this overarching question: how can we nurture the existing links in the current situation and carry on welcoming students, artists and others here now that the UK has left the EU? There's obviously a rather large elephant in our virtual room here. In the medium term, Scotland may or may not rejoin the EU. That depends on how politics plays out in the next few years. But for the purposes of this discussion, if you agree, we're going to consider that that elephant is still a dot on the horizon, and we'll try and focus on the here and now, post-Brexit and pre-whatever happens next. To start with, let's hear from someone who's dealing with that question at the very heart of government, Jenny Gilruth, the Minister for Europe and International Development. Minister, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Etienne. It's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real delight to be with you here this evening and an honour to join such a distinguished panel. The Night of Ideas is, I think, a really welcome idea, and I hope a good opportunity for us to lift our heads above where we are just now in terms of the frankly difficult days that COVID-19 unfortunately has created for us all. And hopefully we can look to the future, and tonight's discussion will allow us to do that. But I'm particularly delighted to be doing this with our friends in the French community. I spent most of my family summer holidays in France, travelling by car from our home in northeast Fife, actually, in Sirming's former constituency, to allow my father to stock up on his wine supplies every year. I'm sure that the family holidays were the real reason we were going to France, but I have some really fond memories of visiting France, particularly in 1998, the last time that Scotland's men's team were in the Football World Cup. And last February, I visited Paris with my partner. Unbeknownst to both of us, it was to be the last time we left Scotland for the foreseeable. But I'm glad that my final pre-COVID trip was to France. And my middle name actually is Madeleine. So a few French connections before going on about the Old Alliance, as I'm sure some will mention following my remarks. There are, of course, some real living connections between Scotland and France, which remain as strong today as they've ever been. France is Scotland's third biggest international export market. You are the third market for our food exports alone, the largest market rather, and we share an enormous number of cultural and historical links. And our universities work extremely closely together, and we're lucky to have thousands of French nationals who call Scotland home. Indeed, my good friend Murray Pittock, who's our public health minister, is married to a Frenchman, Baptiste, and he now calls Angus his home. Of course, I could very easily depress us all by dwelling on Brexit this evening. I won't do that. Managing the many impacts of Brexit would, of course, take more than one night of ideas, but let's not get started on fish. But let me mention one thing, though, in terms of the Erasmus Program. And I think the Erasmus Program was a truly wonderful horizon-expanding scheme that gave people from all walks of life opportunities to live, to study and to work in Europe. And that has helped thousands of EU citizens visit Scotland and share in our culture and our community. And the loss of that scheme is certainly devastating. So the fact that almost 150 MEPs have now written in support of our continuation within the scheme gives us some hope. But maybe saving Scotland's place in Erasmus is the one thing which we could do in terms of safeguarding those links between our countries for future generations on the back of the end of the transition period at the end of last year. So we're being encouraged tonight by Laurence to think about practical links and connections between our countries. I welcome that, but such practical steps work best when they are integral to, of course, a wider vision. And the Scottish Government's vision is clear. We intend to remain outward looking, close to our European friends and neighbours, and Scotland will always be on the side of those who support an inclusive and progressive future in the European Union. And we believe, of course, that it's the right of the people of Scotland to have that right to choose their future as an independent country and as a member of the European Union. In part because we think that's in our interest, but also in part because we share the values on which the EU is built. And in this being Burns Week, let's hold firm to that internationalist vision he articulated so vividly in, amongst other works, A Man's a Man for All That. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'll pass back to you, Etienne.
Many thanks indeed, Minister. Now, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Pierre Vimont. You're an expert in European policy. You've served both at the French Foreign Office and as an ambassador to the EU. What would be the view today from the Quai d'Orsay or from Brussels, do you think, Ambassador?
Thank you, Etienne. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back, even if it's through a virtual process, a device. It's nice to be back at Edinburgh. You know, when I was a very, very young diplomat many years ago, I was posted to London, and my assignment was to look at domestic British politics. One of the great things I had to do was to tour all the political party conferences. And there was a young, new political movement gaining ground, which was called the Scottish National Party at the time, around mid-70s. And so this is when, for the first time, I went to Edinburgh to follow the beginning of the Scottish National Party, and that was great. Let me just give three observations to the questions you have asked. I think from the point of view of the European Union, for many years, and this was very obvious at the time of the 2014 referendum, European leaders want to stay as far as possible for what was then a domestic problem for a member state belonging to the European Union. That was before the Brexit, of course. And you may remember that at the time, questions that were asked, that if the referendum was positive, could Scotland apply to the European Union? And you certainly remember that most of the European leaders tried to run away as far as possible for what was seen then as a toxic issue. I remember even the EU president of the European Commission, was then Jean-Claude Juncker, giving some sort of difficult reply, uneasy, uncomfortable reply to the questions that were raised by media at the time. Now, of course, we are in a totally different situation now, with the United Kingdom being now not anymore a member state, and therefore the question may rise again, and it will be in a totally different situation. To some extent, it's the reverse of what we have seen around 2014. But then my second observation is that even in that new situation that arises now from the post-Brexit situation in which we are, I think for many European Union member states, it is still a very much toxic issue where we could see divisions among the European Union member states because some of them are eager not to create a new antagonism and confrontation with the London government, and others will be, on the contrary, quite ready to show all the shortcomings of the decision that was taken with regard to Brexit. So I wouldn't be surprised that we could be facing, as time goes on, as you were rightly saying, Etienne, nobody can foresee how the whole issue about a new referendum will unfold. But it seems to me that at least one thing is pretty sure in my mind, is that Europeans, member states, will disagree among themselves about how to act there. And here comes my third observation, precisely as the minister was just saying, maybe one way of overcoming this conversation that may put European member states in a sort of uncomfortable position. It seems to me that the best way forward is to move forward in a very concrete and practical way, and to look at issues where something could be done with the Scottish authority. Education, of course, Erasmus was put forward, and I think here is definitely an issue that is to some extent uncontentious between Europeans. Everybody thinks that the decision by London not to join after the decision to leave Europe, the decision not to join the Erasmus program was wrong. Hearing from all the young European students that were eager to come on and to come back to United Kingdom, to Scottish University, or maybe even to English University, a mistake. And a lot of people would agree that by a way or another, we can overcome that difficulty and find ways of moving ahead and having students exchanges between Scottish University and European Union University would be a nice way of moving forward. I think also that maybe another issue where the Scotland Act of 1998 has given powers to the Scottish Authority, we may look where we could maybe work together and move forward. Agriculture, fisheries, culture, these are fields where it seems to me cooperation could move forward. Once again, let's be aware that maybe some European member states will be will be cautious, I would say, or somewhat timid about moving forward there, but others may be more forthcoming. And it seems to me that this is maybe the proper way to move along. I'll stop here, Etienne. I've been quite too long.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Ambassador Pierre Vimont. That was fascinating. I like the notion that fisheries might be a way forward. It might, in the current climate, that might be quite a contentious issue for now, but certainly I'm sure we're going to talk about Erasmus and students. And for perhaps a slightly different view, I turn now to Lord Campbell. You probably have more experience than anyone here, possibly, about the debate about the UK's relationship with Europe and more specifically Scotland's place in Europe. How do you see the state of that relationship today, both as a pro-European politician, but also as the Chancellor of a university that's always been very open to international students?
Well, can we start with education? Because I think that's a bit easier than the politics. First of all, St Andrews University, where I'm the Chancellor, has had always a very strong international element among its students, and we will continue to do that. It is, I suppose, as a matter of cultural outreach, but also, of course, students from outside the United Kingdom do pay enhanced fees, so they're very much part of the economy of many Scottish universities, and St Andrews is no stranger to that. I found this quite a difficult topic to put my mind to for this reason, that we were told that there was an elephant in the room, but we should disregard it. I think that's true, but I think the problem is that the elephant in the room is standing between us and the window, and therefore there's not a great deal of light that we are able to take advantage of for the moment. I mean, I go back to the traditional things. There was a reference, Jenny Gilruth talked about the old alliance. That was a time when our political arrangements, many centuries ago, of course, linked us very closely with France. And then we have the romance, if you like, of Mary Queen of Scots, things of that kind. But there was a stage, I mean, I hope this doesn't sound too facetious, but people often say, well, whiskey is Scotland's national drink. But there actually was a time when what Scotland's national drink was claret from Bordeaux. The port of Leith, which is now, of course, absorbed into Edinburgh, shows very substantial historical connections with the fact that there was a huge amount of trade passed through the port of Leith with France. I don't think, I mean, you implied, and I can make it more expressly, I'm deeply disappointed at the fact that we have left the European Union. I don't believe that people really understand what the consequences of that are going to be, in particular the absence of free movement, the fact that we will become a third country. I'm talking about the United Kingdom, of course. And I think that's not in our interest. And if I could put it this way, I think Britain's departure from Europe weakens Europe, and it also weakens Britain. And for that reason, I regret that very, very much indeed. On Erasmus, I can't understand the small-mindedness of the government. I simply don't understand it. And what they're proposing to put in place, touring, it doesn't seem to me to match up in any way whatsoever. It doesn't have the two-way element, which has been so important from Erasmus. The other point that I wanted to make was that there are, irrespective of politics, there's always culture. And therefore, I think if we are concerned, in particular with our relationship with France, then I think the more opportunities for cultural connections, exchange of exhibitions, twinning, things of that kind. Twinning used to be very popular, but that doesn't seem to have had the same popularity now as it once had. And maybe the change of circumstances will enhance that. I think the truth is that it's a bit like Nelson putting the telescope to the blind eye and saying, I see no signal. We do not yet know what the long-term consequences of this quite dynamic, dramatic change in our relationship with Europe, and therefore with France as well, will be. And while I understand the importance of trying to set out some principles here, I doubt if it's going to be easy on practicality. But I have one practical suggestion, which I hope you will not find too facetious. And that is that Scotland and France would get on even better than they do at the moment if you let us win occasionally at Stade de France. And if you will always ensure that Finn Russell is released from his club so that he can play for Scotland. It's rather facetious, but that's a very important link. And people ask me if I'm obsessed about politics. I'm not obsessed about politics. I'm obsessed about sport. And I've been to the Parc des Princes, and I've been to Stade de France, and that's the kind of exchange which I think stands ahead and beyond any political divergence which may have occurred as a result of Brexit.
Many thanks, Lord Campbell. Professor Pittock, you are the Pro-Vice Principal of another ancient Scottish university, and you're very interested as a historian in Scotland's connections abroad, past connections as well. You wrote recently about how the diversity of Edinburgh and its international outlook were one of the factors behind the success of the city in the 18th century during the Enlightenment. How important is Scotland's European past right now as it starts charting a new course in 2021, do you think?
Well, of course, it's very important because the first thing to say is that European history surrounds us and culture surrounds us everywhere in Scotland, from the bricks of the Flanders ballast, which make up a large part of the town down towards the harbour, and indeed in the old town in Aberdeen, to the chateau-like designs of Holyrood Palace, and the close stairs and apartment dwelling, which Edinburgh copied more or less directly from Paris, or indeed the prevalence of Dutch gables and Dutch building in Scotland. All of these things are with us still as a part of the infrastructure of what made us who we are. I mean, I myself got married in a Scottish cathedral under the shield boss of John Stuart, Earl of Buchan and Constable of France, which neatly joins the two traditions. But that history, I think, in many ways, that history has sometimes a more economic resonance in France, paradoxically, than in Scotland. For example, in Aubigny-sur-Ner in 1990, the local authorities latched on to John Stuart of Darnley, whose family were seigneurs there till the 17th century, to launch their Scottish festival. And that festival is actually, with its associated work in produce and produce culture and food, helped to inject quite a lot of money into the local economy in Aubigny. It is one of the things we need to remember, that history, culture, and provenance sell. But where we're starting from now is a slightly different position. We're starting from a situation where, if you look at the Anholt GfK Roper Brands Index of how Scotland's viewed globally, which the Scottish government have been commissioning since 2008, actually the recognition of a national Scottish culture is at a much lower level in France. France is actually one of the lowest in the world for recognizing a national Scottish culture, rather paradoxically. But where it is recognized, that recognition is very strong. However, that recognition that is so strong tends to be strong in particular ways. For example, I briefed the External Affairs Directorate at their away day 3 years ago, pointed out really that culture dominates the vision of Scotland. Scotland is a place of castles, to a lesser extent sport. People do notice the results. Sorry, Lord Campbell. They led to a place of culture, of history, of tradition. Is not a place of technological development and scientific innovation, even though it demonstrably on the data is. And that's just a global issue about Scotland's, the way Scotland is viewed outside the country. So I think one of the things to turn to the contemporary and what we need to think about doing next, particularly in a French context. And I think that, however, there's a model which can serve other European relationships depending on the scale and size, and as Ambassador Vimont says, the enthusiasm of those relationships, is that if you look at, say, the opportunities identified by the Scottish Government's hub in Paris, the focus on climate change and renewables is a very significant area where Scotland has had a high degree of performance and success, and where there's an enormous amount of technical capacity in France and a great deal to talk about. I think also university research accelerated incubator links, particularly linked to the process of company spin-outs, is another area which we could look at very carefully across the two jurisdictions. And lastly, I'm certainly going to leave out food, drink, and culture, not just because I'm of course an enormous enthusiast for French regional cuisine and really all French cuisine of every type, but so is Scotland. Judging by the way Scoto French restaurants in their fusion way have taken over the high end of Scottish, or premium end of Scottish dining. But I'm also struck by, and this is about areas of local strength, where, for example, Amiens 4 years ago hosted an event which was both a university event and a civic event to mark the 250th anniversary of the new town of Edinburgh, when, of course, Edinburgh wasn't doing anything about it. And so that was rather nice to see. And also nice to see was the significant colloquium on Scottish food, particularly the regulation, development, and sale of Scottish food after Brexit at the University of Grenoble a couple of years ago. So there are areas of real enthusiasm, and I'm an enthusiast for this too, because my report on Burns, the Scottish economy for the Scottish Government last year, showed exactly how much you can get out financially of produce and culture, because those are two. Produce is culture, food is culture, and we often forget that and market those two things differently. So what happens next? Well, I think the Scottish and Irish government's bilateral review is not a model that can be, which is just reported 2 weeks ago, is not a model that can be replicated exactly in a Scoto French context. But it is an interesting model because it came out of a series of platform discussions. First of all, those held by the British and Irish Chambers of Commerce, and also those held by universities, and also those enabled by the Scottish Government hub in the British Embassy in Dublin, and by the Irish Consulate General in Edinburgh. And quite clearly, those diplomatic, academic, and commercial platforms are three ways for significant conversations to start. I would suggest in the French context an even more focused set of criteria and ambitions where the two jurisdictions can talk to each other and develop better initially working practices which are joint, and then better and working practices which are more than the sum of their parts. I was very pleased 4 years ago to see just how outstanding French augmented reality and mixed reality research was in reviewing the funding for the new funding packages for the development of postgraduate museum and gallery education in France. And I think we've got a lot to learn from that, and that's something where there's also a lot of work going on in Scotland. So in terms of culture and produce and tourism, in terms of business accelerators and spin-out companies from universities, and in terms of climate change renewables, those are three platform areas where I think we can usefully start conversations in some of these safe and neutral spaces, which are the government hubs, universities, and the chambers of commerce environment.
Many thanks, Professor Pittock. Do send us your questions. One question for slightly later will be whether government hubs, for instance, can be neutral institutions, and whether soft power can be exercised within the confines of the United Kingdom or not in a way that's distinctive. I'm sure that will come up in the conversation. But before we go there, and thank you very much, Professor Pittock, I'm going to ask Professor Cardwell, as someone who's both French and British, it's probably appropriate for you to conclude this round of presentations. You're, of course, also an expert in the international aspects of education. Erasmus, we've already heard, is particularly topical. How important is it that we're able to maintain or perhaps reset relations with EU citizens, both in Scotland and beyond?
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation. You're quite right, I'm now a citizen of both, but because of the lockdown, I haven't actually been able to use the acquisition of my French citizenship by travelling anywhere since I got it 1 year ago. I agree wholeheartedly with the comments that are made about Erasmus. I think it's a decision which will leave the UK worse off, and Scotland in terms of universities and the possibility for exchanges. I don't think that replacing it, a system that's been in place and developed and evolved over 30 years with another scheme within a few months is going to be particularly realistic. And I also don't think that it will force anyone, whether universities or individuals, to look beyond Europe. I think there are very many structural barriers in doing so, which I've written about quite a lot. And certainly, I would also, to echo what Lord Campbell said about Erasmus being about incoming students. We often focus on the opportunities to go abroad, but it's about those incoming students and the effect that they have being in a classroom with students who may not use Erasmus, but nevertheless have this opportunity to engage. And because Erasmus has been so well developed, it is also provided over the long term a significant amount of soft power. And we can see now amongst political leaders across Europe who are of the kind of Erasmus generation, there's a knowledge and understanding about different countries, but particularly because of the success of universities in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, that people have come and gone back with an understanding. And over time, that risks being lost unless we try to find ways to either continue within Erasmus or to try and replace it or make the most of what we have. I think the other thing out with that, although Erasmus focuses a lot in our imagination about higher education, and that's what it's become known for, Erasmus covers a lot more than that, and it covers things like work placements and so on, apprenticeships and internships. And that also is very challenging to continue because Erasmus is very much related to the underpinning law on free movement, which no longer applies. So I think that helping young people to gain experience, which is valuable for skills in the workplace, is going to be much more challenging without this right to move freely across Europe. So I think some of the practical steps that can be taken to kind of reset and try to ensure that this engagement continues is to strengthen language learning at all levels, so including in schools. I've been involved in the launch of a languages toolkit, which feeds into from school to university, and much wider learning about languages, of which the focus will remain on European languages, including French, but also to think about ways in which some of the bureaucratic hurdles that are going to be coming our way about going out and also coming in. We really need to think about how these can be, how we can facilitate the possibility of exchange. Because at the heart of all this, and what is at the heart of Erasmus, is about people being physically able to move and understand the sense of the place that they're in, the people that they meet, and so on. I say this from personal experience of having done so, but also having been in classrooms for 20 odd years with students who've come under Erasmus or as international students. So universities certainly are already highly engaged with European universities. Those links will continue. We know that European universities have been very keen to continue links under a bilateral arrangements. But of course, the problem is the institutional barriers as well, and the funding. And I think one of the great things about Erasmus and what it has done was allow students who have not had the financial means necessarily to be able to take part. And that's my great fear about the new scheme, is that it will not actually do what its aim is, which is to allow the students with the least financial means to be able to go to the US or Australia. Speaking from practical experience, that is very difficult to do, and I find it very difficult to believe that it will adequately replace Erasmus. So I would support moves for Scottish universities to be still part of it, despite the barriers that exist in order to make that happen.
Many thanks, Professor Cardwell. I've already got a couple of interesting questions on my screen. One from Hugh Torrance, referring directly to Erasmus. The cost of which, and that was one of the arguments, wasn't it, that Boris Johnson put it at £2 billion net outflow from the United Kingdom, which was the reason the UK government gave for abandoning Erasmus. Anyway, here's the question. To what extent do you think the Erasmus Plus decision is motivated by the longer game of ideological opposition to European identity? There's a real battleground here about citizenship and identity rather than simply education and mobility opportunities. If I can ask you, I know they're very complicated and even controversial questions, but the shorter your answers are, the more questions we can get in. And I'm sure our viewers would appreciate that. Who wants to go first?
May I?
Lord Campbell.
Yeah. Well, of course, what he said was we weren't getting value for money, which is the most extraordinary way in which to justify the departure from something whose value extends far beyond pounds and pence. I harbour a rather sinister thought, is that the present government rather alarmed at the prospect that young people from the United Kingdom would go into Europe and discover that Europe was not the huge bogeyman which had been created for the purpose of getting out of the European Union. Now, that may be an entirely simplistic view, but I do think it reflects something which, of course, was an obstacle to Britain joining the European Union or the European community, as it was, the view of General de Gaulle that we were much more interested in the Atlantic than we were in the continent of Europe and with the relationship with the United States. And it may be that part of this, part of the thinking behind this, either consciously or subconsciously, was since we have withdrawn from the European Union, since the alliance with the United States is of great importance, then what we ought to be doing is sending people to the United States rather than people going to Europe. One last point, if I may, very, very quickly. I wholeheartedly support the notion that we start teaching foreign languages in Scottish schools and in Scottish universities again, because I think failure to do so will make us insular.
Jenny Gilruth, you wanted to say something as well on this?
Thank you. So, Etienne, the question was whether or not this was ideological opposition to European identity. I'm not necessarily sure that's true. I think part of the UK government's worldview in terms of Brexit is about we know sovereignty, and any suggestion that their sovereignty could be undermined by the European Union was always at the forefront, certainly in the reports and the readouts and negotiations. And remembering, of course, the Scottish Government wasn't round the negotiating table, so we couldn't get that direct input into the talks, which was particularly challenging on areas such as fish, for example. So I don't necessarily think it's an opposition to European identity. I think it's almost the UK government trying to carve out their identity and their own approach to how they deliver on things. And this is why they want to be different. And they want to be different for all the wrong reasons. Erasmus was a fantastic scheme which worked well for Scotland for many different reasons, but it generated a lot of income for Scotland as well. Scots went overseas and it was good for us. So I think that sharing of educational links was not necessarily a threat to the UK government. I think it was about their ideological obsession per se with this notion of sovereignty. And then on Ming's point about languages in schools, I was a secondary teacher before I was elected in 2016. Languages is delivered in Scottish schools, of course, under Curriculum for Excellence through the broad general education, but I do think it's hugely important. I'm speaking actually at a languages event next week with a former colleague of mine. I think it is hugely important. I learned French at school. I'm not going to try out my rusty higher French on you here, but I think that languages development is a huge part of solidifying those cultural links, and Erasmus takes that one step further, of course.
Pierre Vimont, did you want to, or Paul Cardwell, who would like to go next?
I won't take too much of your time because I think everything has been said, but just 2 points. The first one, I think the financial argument you were alluding to, and that was put forward by the British government, is certainly one that must not be belittled. It is there, no doubt about it. As for the second point, was it a move to try to get away from European identity? Maybe to some extent you may have a point there, but it seems to me that this is the logic of the Brexit decision. It was, for at least as a first stage, to move away from everything that was European and the European Union. If you talk about getting back control, it's about desaligning from much of what the European Union was doing. And therefore, for me, it doesn't come as a total surprise. Now, let's be optimistic. Maybe a second stage will slowly creep in after a while, where the United Kingdom will want to slowly move back towards its former European Union partners and try to set up as much as possible some sort of common ground. But for the time being, it's quite obvious. Think about foreign policy, think about defense, security matters. For the moment, it's very difficult to have a full discussion, a useful and genuine discussion with our British partner. For the time being, they want to move on their own, and I think we have to some extent to accept that.
There's a question here from David Gow, which is relevant as well. And the question is still on Erasmus. Could there be a special protocol reinstating it in Scotland? And I think one of the things this question is addressing is if we've seen there's a distinctive relationship between Scotland and Europe, as compared to the relationship England has with Europe, for instance. Is that not a potential point of severe friction in the post-Brexit context? The more links are strengthened between Scotland and continental European, universities, the more tension there will be between London and Edinburgh. And is that a problem?
Well, if I may say so, I think it really depends on how it's done. Because if I'm about to Paul here and his views has the expertise, but my understanding is that the re-inclusion of Scotland in the normative Erasmus scheme at the top level will be extremely difficult for all sorts of reasons, both linked to freedom of movement and to the state signatory and state budget holders. But what is not so difficult to imagine is some form of wiggle room around the redevelopment and expansion of Erasmus Mundus, which will enable bilateral partnerships sourced in the EU to pick up co-investigator participants in Scotland. Now, I think that is not going to create the kind of tension you suggested. It provides an air hole, a release of pressure in a country which is, where I may say, did a great deal to found Erasmus through Winnie Ewing, but also is a great fan of Erasmus, and without actually creating the tension on state level, which a re-entry to the scheme per se at the top level would do. And I don't think that top level is practical, but I think European Union is so expert in finding interesting wiggle room.
Paul Cardwell, did you want to say something? Yes, I mean, with my law academic hat on, I mean, the Erasmus program is governed by law, it's governed by regulation, and that specifies that non-member states can be part to it. So Turkey has been very, very active in Erasmus, even though it's not obviously in the European Union. So those possibilities are there. In terms of ideological, I mean, I think it was partly ideological, not necessarily on identity. As I mentioned before, we focus on higher education exchange because that's what it's known for. But over time, Erasmus has evolved into something which tries to tackle some of the problems that European countries have been criticized for, particularly youth unemployment. And so Erasmus is very much embedded within wider programs. And that's why the cost of it does seem a lot higher than if it was just about the education aspects, which over time, because we're so familiar with it, kind of runs itself. So I think that it is ideological in the sense that it's an EU program. Most of the spending there depends on the European institutions. And whilst you can be part of it as a non-member state, you don't really get a full seat at the table. So I think that was the issue about it. But one of the issues that universities have as well is that until last year, the UK government was saying that it wasn't under threat, and it was only very much at the last minute. I think if the Turing scheme had been launched as the sort of global Britain front of education, in addition to Erasmus membership, I think, I and many others would be jumping for joy at that possibility of funding students to go elsewhere, which, they already do, but without the financing that's allowed under Erasmus. And again, the looking at the numbers of incoming and outgoing, yes, we know that traditionally more students have come into Scotland and the UK generally than outgoing, but on the financial terms, the impact that's had, supported by reports over many years about the direct impact that students have financially on universities and communities in university towns in Scotland and across the UK. But also there's informal links as well. We know that it's generated knowledge about UK universities and excellence in our universities, which has generated interest then from other students to come in to do fee-paying masters and so on. That's very, very difficult to look at in terms of, difficult to calculate in terms of economic benefit, because it relies on this kind of soft power model. And I think, unfortunately, we'd only see the negative effects of that, of not being in Erasmus, many years on from now.
The other aspect of students who might want to come and study in Scotland is, of course, cost to them. Lord Campbell mentioned the revenue to universities, but that's a cost to the students, and that's now going up to between £10,000 and £26,000 a year. Is there a kind of double whammy as a result of Brexit?
Inevitably, yes, because it would be discriminatory not to charge the overseas fees. However, there are options, because many students who come to the UK are very highly qualified from Europe and elsewhere, and some universities can be in a position to offer talent scholarships to such students. And because of the demand to enter as non-Erasmus entrants, many of the leading UK universities from the EU, a lot of the students who enter are very highly qualified indeed. So there is a possible benefit, which would be completely non-discriminatory in terms of the quality and caliber of students that we attract.
If I may, we've got about 15 minutes left. We've been granted an extension, I'm told, to 22 for anyone who's able to stay past the allotted time. There is a question here from Jordan Girardin about Scotland's wider links to Europe, and perhaps we should remember that although we're all very interested in France, naturally, France, the French population in Scotland is relatively smaller than other groups, as many Slovakians as French Europeans in Scotland. Polish Scots, if you like, or Polish residents in Scotland are far greater in number. So Jordan Girardin's question is this: where does Scotland fit in as a region of Europe? Is it a northern country? Is it part of some kind of Celtic arc, or where does it? It has relationships historically with many parts of Europe. Where does that future relationship fit in terms of Scotland's European identity? Does anyone want to answer?
Maybe have a shot at answering, Etienne. I think Scotland, I wouldn't want to put us in a box. The question is quite wide-ranging, but I suppose I would cite some of our work with regard to the Arctic. And I think we have a real opportunity through our Arctic work to offer a different vantage in terms of Scotland's work on that. I know that work being undertaken by SAMS and UHI at the moment is looking in particular at our natural environment in Scotland and how that offers different opportunities to potentially other geographical locations that are considered part of that Arctic group of countries. And I've spoken to the EU's Arctic ambassador on this point, and it was a really helpful conversation. But I think in terms of, we've spoken today about the different areas in which Scotland can have our say, as it were. And one of the issues that I have responsibility for is international development, and I'm keen to speak to other European nations on how they approach that matter. So having those conversations at a policy level, I think, are hugely important. And even in the last couple of days within the Scottish Government, we've had really positive talks with 3 member states. So with Ireland on student mobility, we've heard from Murray about the bilateral review. We've had discussions this week with France on fish exports and with Germany on Erasmus and hydrogen. So it does feel that the conversation is opening up, but I don't think we want to put Scotland in a box in terms of labelling us with regard to how we approach our Europeanness, as it were. I think we've got many different things to offer, a lot of it stemming from our history, but a lot from our landscape, I think, and the unique place that we sit in the world. I think the question is quite wide-ranging, but in terms of our aspirations going forward, we very much see ourselves aligned with European values, and I think that that's something that's come up time and again, certainly in conversations with European counterparts. There is an awareness now, without being overtly political, that potentially there was in 2014 of Scotland's relationship with the European Union, and particularly in terms of our values and culture as a country.
Pierre Vimont, you alluded to the fact that the view Europeans have, the understanding Europeans have of Scotland can be quite different according to countries. Germany has a very different image of Scotland than France, for instance. Just to give a personal example, whenever I go to France and whenever I say to people here I'm French, then people say, "Oh, mention the old alliance," within seconds. When I go to France and talk about the old alliance, no one's ever heard about it. It's quite an asymmetrical relationship. and French people obviously have a very romanticized view of Scotland as well, and aren't too much on top of the politics. So what does that mean for the way Scotland relates to all these different European countries?
The Polish connection is an interesting one because, to a very large extent, it grew out of the Second World War because lots of Polish individuals were enrolled into the British Armed Forces. At Arnhem, for example, the 1st Airborne Division was supported by the Polish Airborne Brigade. And of course, when the war ended, then for many of them, it simply wasn't possible to go back home. And in around Fife, for example, I mean, in St Andrews, we've got a statue to Sikorsky, which was put up quite recently, well, in the last 10 or 15, by way of public subscription. There's absolutely no problem about raising the money for that purpose. And it reflected the fact that there was this strong Polish presence, simply because it was no longer possible for them to go back to their home country. And so therefore, when the freedom of movement opened up, many people came from Poland here because they had, as it were, friends and relations, antecedents. So that, I think, is why that one has been particularly strong. Just one other point. We've just finished a musical event called Celtic Connections. And that, very properly, you might think, sets out to showcase the fact that we are, in Scotland, a Celtic nation. If we're a European nation, we're certainly a Celtic nation as well.
Is that a helpful label, being a Celtic nation?
I think it's just I think it's diversity. The point for which was being made a moment or two ago.
I asked the question because that also has many different interpretations according to whether you're in Brittany or Galicia or maybe Bavaria, for all I know.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to? How does Scotland deal with this complex moving target that is Europe?
That's exactly the point I wanted to make. The European Union is a moving target, changing very quickly today. And of course, depending on the different standpoints that you take, be it historical, geographical, looking at it from the point of view of energy policy or climate change or whatever, you could put Scotland in different boxes, I guess, in different groupings. But what I find striking at the moment with regard to the European Union is that there is a new structural trend moving in, which is all about flexibility. In all the major political issues that we have been facing recently, just look at the many and very difficult discussions that took place among European Union member states on the whole issue of the recovery plan and the and how to move along there. One could see different political groups gathering together and creating a new type of European Union where you have core groups defending their own interest. And you have definitely a group of what could be called the liberal member states, or some other would have called them the frugals, around the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Austria. You have the Central and Eastern European member states. You have the country from the Southern Europe. And then you have somewhere France and Germany trying to find their place among all these different groups. And this is a moving target, as you were saying, Etienne. This is going on and moving on and changing and morphing into different groups as it goes on. So it would be, in my mind, very difficult to put Scotland in any one of these groups at the moment, because they are changing, and it's still, in any way, it hasn't found a sort of new structural balance at the moment. it's quite interesting to observe and to see how things are going to go on. But I wouldn't bet on any definitive balance between those different groups at the moment.
You mentioned the word interesting. Perhaps as a conclusion from each of you, if you would, could I ask you to for your concluding thoughts in about 1 minute before we finish this conversation on this very complex topic. We were discussing the time between now, post-Brexit, and the next phase of the relationship, which is at this point unpredictable. Are the next few years going to be interesting in a Chinese kind of way, do you think? Who would like to speak first to that?
I can start. The Chinese wording is a curse in China.
It's a curse, exactly.
I'm not sure we could hope interesting times for Scotland. That wouldn't be the right way to proceed. I think one should remain optimistic as all the consequences and the implications of Brexit will unfold, and it is very difficult to predict how it will go. I think there is definitely a place for Scotland, and I think it has to be done in a smart way without trying to create more frustration, antagonism, and confrontation. But if it is done in the proper way, practical, looking at issues like climate change, like education, like culture, we're talking also about food, why not? There is a way forward. And I think this is what must be, in a very pragmatic way, this is what must be found out as we move along.
Who would like to?
I can go next.
Go next. Thank you.
I think what the last 4 years have told us is that there has been quite a lot of reflection about what it means to be a member state, and now there'll need to be reflection on what it means to not be a member state and within the EU. And I think for so many years, the stark contrast, and it is a moving target in a different sense, the EU, because of the way that we think about it. In France, we often hear people talk about the European Union as a project, c'est construire quelque chose. Whereas time after again, when teaching young people, I'll say, well, what is the European Union? And the answer will be, well, the European Union is an economic or trade project. And so, well, it's not really. That's one of the ways that it gets about to do what the process was for. It was about integration. And because within the UK, generally, that's been suppressed as an idea, as to sort of say, well, it's really there for functional trade reasons. I think that in the future, if there is a debate about whether to rejoin, whether that's for Scotland or even for the UK more generally, then it's going to have to be a much deeper understanding of what it means, that it cannot be done on such a functional basis. So I think in the meantime, of course, a greater understanding between Scotland and European neighbours, and particularly, I think it's absolutely right that Jenny said that this is often about values, and looking at the wider world, we can see things that we share with other countries around the world, but we can see an enormous amount that we share within Europe. So I think certainly on culture, but of course in education, that's where the future lies.
But there's building up tension, is there not? When you take the current attitude of the Polish government, the current attitude of the Hungarian government, we were nearly at the point, and until there was a very clever European fix, we were nearly at the point of saying, look, you can't get any money out of Brussels because you don't accept the values of human rights, which are right at the very heart of this enterprise. And one, I think, has to remember that this all came out of a war and a determination that there shouldn't be, there were 3 wars in 100 years, weren't there? The determination that this should not scar Europe. But it seems to me that at various stages, it's been about trade, but at other stages, it's been about an identity in a world which appeared to be dominated by the United States. Now, the world may be heavily under the influence of China, what sort of Europe will we get out of that by way of response? Not least if, of course, China, as it has happened in many instances, uses, if you like, financial diplomacy as a way of establishing relationships. And then, as is from time to time the case, those who've been given the extensive loans are unable to pay, then there's a political price to pay. And I think, given that attitudes, for example, about Russia are different, that Russia's on the move in an effort to try and destabilize certain parts of Europe, then I think it's very difficult to make a prediction as to what kind of Europe Scotland might be joining.
If I might allow the Minister the last word and therefore go next. I think that it's difficult to judge the geopolitics from where we sit now. One of the things that's very obvious is that we live in an era of simple answers to complex questions. And that is the Polish issue, that's the Hungarian issue, until recently it was the American issue, and that is the Brexit issue. Now, in terms of what Scotland has to offer, all identity is relational, and that's one of the glories of the European project, that it actually understands relational identities. Scotland is a uniquely relational identity as a country. It's a uniquely relational history because it's been interacting with other countries throughout all of its history, and not just in UK terms in the British imperial period. It's always had a global and relational presence, and that is one of the things that thinking from inside Scotland can contribute in terms both of the way Scotland's perceived through Anna Roper and the British Council's soft power assessment of Scotland. Scotland's a trusted place for working out political differences and political challenges, partly because of its relational history. We can't actually change the geopolitical relations which will govern the world in the next 20 years. What we can do is start to build block by block the relationships of Scotland to member states in the remaining EU, the 27 member states, on the basis of shared interests by the practical small steps which we've been indicating tonight to move forward in the next 2 to 3 years to a wider range of small scale but nonetheless strategically significant cooperations which may differ from state to state.
I fear I have to leave. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lord Campbell.
Thank you very much indeed. I much enjoyed it.
And the final word goes to you, Jenny Gilruth, to conclude our discussion.
Thank you, Etienne. I mean, I suppose to reflect on the geopolitics of the world that Murray spoke of there. We in Scotland are not immune from the impacts of those things, but I think our case and our cause for European membership remains. Whether or not Europe changes remains to be seen. But this moment in time, we know that we would be richer, we would be better off if we were in Europe for lots of different reasons. And of course, I think we need to reflect on the values of our people who voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. So just as a practical example, the government passed at the end of last year the Continuity Bill. That legislation allows us to keep pace with key pieces of European legislation. And I think, again, demonstrates something of our values in terms of where we want to be with regard to the EU's core values, including human rights, and particularly with regard to the environment. But as we move forward, it doesn't come as any surprise to anyone on the panel that the Scottish Government supports independence and supports Scotland rejoining the European Union. So we will continue to work with our European partners and to make the positive case for that to happen. And I really enjoyed being part of tonight's discussion. It's been hugely interesting to have this kind of wide-reaching opportunity to speak to you all. So thank you. And Etienne, your mum's from Banffshire, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Oh, my sisters were both born in Banff. I'm from the northeast originally. There you go.
From Portsoy, to be precise. Well, thank you very much for joining us on this conversation, Jenny. And thank you, of course, to all our panelists, Ambassador Pierre Vimont, Lord Campbell, Professor Murray Pittock and Professor Paul Cardwell. It was a very stimulating conversation. I've also been asked by the Consul General Laurence Baïs to thank you very much for joining us, and our thanks to her and the French Institute for making this Nuit des Idées possible. Bonsoir et à bientôt.
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
Au revoir. Bien. Merci.